We're going to go to screen sharing and pick up where we left off yesterday. If you remember, we were talking about amphibians. We had just gotten started on them. So when we look at amphibians, there's a couple of things we can keep in mind. We're going to talk about their circulatory system. But before we talk about their circulatory system, there's two items I want to talk about briefly first. So keep in mind, amphibians are frogs and toads, salamanders, and a lot of relatives of salamanders. There are some things that you may not have heard of called newts, or efts, or mud puppies. And these are basically all different types of salamanders. Some of them get quite big. There are some mud puppies that get 2 or 3 feet long. So they're pretty intimidating. When we look at amphibians, amphibia literally means something that lives both lives. And I think we said yesterday, but this is because they live on the land and in water. And amphibians are the first group of what we consider to be tetrapods, things that have 4 limbs. So think of the arms and legs on a person. In most animals, it's just 4 legs. In birds, it's 2 legs and 2 wings, but all of these groups are considered to be tetrapods: amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds. When we look at amphibians, amphibians always start out with an aquatic larval stage. So think of the tadpole that you see before we get a frog or a toad. And then after the larva changes into the adult, in most cases, the adult lives on dry land. That's why they live both lives. However, although the adult amphibians can live on land, they usually have to live close to water. And they have to live close to water for a couple of reasons. One of the reasons is because their skin is very permeable to water. Now, remember from 105, when something is permeable to a material, that material can go through it. So since the skin of amphibians is permeable to water, they lose a lot of water by evaporation, and they can dehydrate. So they kind of have to live in a moist environment. Now, to reduce the loss of water, a lot of amphibians have mucus glands under the skin, and they secrete a slimy, oily mucus onto the surface of the skin. For a lot of toads, it's very noticeable. Their skin feels oily when you touch it. Well, remember that oils are a type of lipid. And one of the things we know about lipids is that lipids don't mix very well with water. So these mucus glands secrete this oily mucus onto the surface of the skin. You know, you could think of it almost like sweat glands in a person, except sweat is more water than oil. But this oil provides a kind of waterproofing so that amphibians don't lose as much water as they would otherwise. But despite the fact that they don't lose as much water, they still have to live near water typically, because they've got to get in water every once in a while and kind of rehydrate their body. Now, there's another reason why amphibians have to live near water, and this is because of the way that they reproduce. Amphibians reproduce using what's called external fertilization. If we look at the reproductive anatomy, what we see is that in amphibians, the male doesn't have a penis that he uses to insert the sperm into the female. In species where this happens, then the female's body provides the water for the sperm to swim to the eggs. But since amphibians don't do this, amphibians have to be near an aquatic environment in order to reproduce, because amphibians have external reproduction, or external fertilization, it's sometimes referred to as. And what this means is the eggs are fertilized external, outside of the female's body. So males and females typically synchronize the release of eggs and sperm They're right next to each other. They're in the water. Most frogs carry out a process called amplexus, where the male climbs on top of the female. He kind of squeezes her side like a little accordion, and the eggs come out, and then he releases the sperm. They're both released in the water very close to each other. So this increases the odds of the sperm fertilizing the eggs. But notice it's still a potential problem since they're not being released inside the female's body. When we look at species that use external fertilization, they usually produce more sperm and more eggs. Why? Because if you release your sperm and eggs into the water, there's at least a possibility that the current carries them apart from each other. So you have to make more sperm and eggs just to make sure that you reproduce successfully. So this is another reason why amphibians have to live in water. Notice that fish also have external fertilization. And we don't see it very much with amphibians, but with some fish, we see an additional strategy to increase their odds of having their sperm fertilize an egg or having an egg get fertilized by a sperm, depending on which gender we're thinking about. Sometime soon in Lake Michigan, if you listen to the news, you may hear somebody talking about the smelt run. And smelt are a small type of fish that lives in Lake Michigan. And smelt reproduce in the spring. Like a lot of animals, they reproduce in the spring so that when their offspring are born, the weather's just getting nice, there's more food available. Winter is usually a pretty tough season for most animals. But when the smelt run, large numbers of smelt gather in one area. And it's kind of a smelt orgy. All the females release their eggs, all the males release their sperm. So instead of just one individual releasing her eggs and one individual releasing his sperm, you have dozens or hundreds of fish in the same area releasing their eggs and sperm. So statistically, there's a much better chance if you're a female that your egg gets fertilized. If you're a male, there's a much better chance statistically that your sperm finds an egg to fertilize. So animals that use external fertilization sometimes have to use some tricks. Now, there are actually a few amphibians that have internal fertilization. There are some salamanders, and when these salamanders reproduce, the male drops a packet of sperm, kind of a little UPS package, and the female picks up this packet with her hind legs and stuffs it into her cloaca, and the cloaca leads into her vagina. So basically she picks up the eggs, picks up the sperm, pushes them into her reproductive system, and then the eggs are fertilized internally. So this increases your odds of successful fertilization. So amphibians have to live near water for at least two reasons. They tend to lose water, so they're in danger of dehydration, and they have to be near water to reproduce. Now, there are a few amphibians that live in very dry environments like deserts, and a lot of them basically cover themselves in a cocoon of mud. And we don't call it hibernation, we call it estivation, but they estivate for the whole year until the rainy season comes. Most deserts have a rainy season for a week or two, and then the rain kind of dissolves their little mud cocoon. There's a small temporary pond, and all the amphibians come out and they reproduce during that time. They eat as much as they can, and then they build a little mud cocoon to last through the next 50 weeks or so until the next rainy season comes. But they do have to have some water, at least during that time when they're reproducing. Now, the other thing we can think about with amphibians, and keep in mind that amphibians evolved from the osteichthyes, from the lobe-fin fish. We talked about one specific example, a genus called the coelacanthus, the other day. So amphibians evolved from fish, reptiles evolved from amphibians, and then mammals and birds evolved from reptiles. If we look at the cardiovascular system in a fish, the cardiovascular system in a fish has a thickening of one of its blood vessels. And this thickening is what we call the heart. And in a fish, there are only two chambers in the heart. There's a smaller chamber called the atrium, and it's forward on the fish. If the fish were standing on its tail, it would be on top. And there's a larger chamber called the ventricle. Now the white on this diagram of the fish heart represents the muscle. Notice that the muscle is much thicker in the ventricle down below than it is in the atrium up above. This is because we can see part of a little blood vessel coming in here to the atrium. This blood vessel brings the blood back to the atrium after it's been to the fish's body. Then the atrium simply pumps the blood to the ventricle. Well, that's not very far, so the atrium doesn't need a lot of muscle to do that. The ventricle then contracts, and when the ventricle contracts, it pumps the blood to the rest of the body. The blood goes through the gills, then it goes to the rest of the body, and in the gills, it picks up oxygen. When it goes to the rest of the body, it drops off oxygen. Now, if we compare that to what we see with an amphibian, though, amphibians have a three-chambered heart. They have two atria. Now, keep in mind, if we think of this like a medical situation, you're looking at your patient. So the right atrium is the one in blue on our amphibian. It's actually on the left side as we're looking at it, but remember, we're facing our patient. The left atrium is this orange over here. And then there's one ventricle. Well, the right atrium receives blood that's coming back from the body that just dropped off oxygen. So that's why this is colored kind of a grayish color. We usually represent blood that doesn't have very much oxygen in it as kind of a gray or even a blue color. So this blood is called deoxygenated blood. The right atrium receives blood that's coming back from the lungs, where it's just picked up oxygen. And this blood is usually represented, they show it as more an orange, but a lot of times it's shown as more of a red color. And this is oxygenated blood. Now notice the deoxygenated blood, the blue, purple, gray, whatever you want to call this, still has a little tiny bit of oxygen in it. It doesn't have 0% oxygen. I don't want to give you that impression. And this orangish blood, this oxygenated blood, still has a little bit of carbon dioxide in it. It doesn't have 0 carbon dioxide. Now, when the blood comes in, again, the right atrium and the left atrium push the blood to the ventricle. Now, there's only one ventricle, and this is where the problem comes in. When the blood goes down to the ventricle, deoxygenated blood mixes with oxygenated blood. Now, that's a problem because when the ventricle contracts, it pumps the blood out of the heart, and half the blood, approximately, goes to the body to deliver oxygen. Half the blood, approximately, goes to the lungs to pick up more oxygen. Well, what's the problem? Down in the ventricle, oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood mixed. So that means some of the blood that's being pumped to the body is deoxygenated blood. It just came back from the body. So it's not going to have any oxygen to drop off, basically. Some of the blood that's being pumped to the lungs just came from the lungs. So it already has as much oxygen as it can hold. It's not going to be able to pick up any more. So the problem with having a heart with 3 chambers like this is that it's not very efficient. You're pumping some blood to the lungs that doesn't need to pick up oxygen. You're pumping some blood to the rest of the body. It's called the systemic circulation that doesn't really have any oxygen to give up. So as a result, if we look at amphibians aren't very good at aerobic activities. When we look at amphibians, they're sprinters. They're not distance runners. I had a friend who was studying some toads once, and we used to go out to the Indiana Dunes parks at night and collect toads. And when I first went out with them, I was kind of nervous if I would be able to catch them. And he said, "Oh, don't worry, it's real easy. Just keep walking towards them." And I discovered what he meant, because think about the idea that these animals are sprinters. If you would walk towards a toad slowly, they would hop away from you, and they'd go 6 or 7 hops, and they'd go real fast. And if you just kept walking steady after 6 or 7 hops, they'd stop, and it would look like they were breathing really hard, trying to catch their breath, because they're sprinters. And if you just kept walking towards them, when you got close, they'd hop away again. But this time they didn't catch their breath completely, so they'd only go 3 or 4 hops, and then they'd stop and catch their breath. And if you keep walking towards them, they'd hop away again, and they'd go about 1 hop, and then you could just bend over and pick them up. So when we look at amphibians, since they're sprinters, think about what we discussed in Biology 105. Sprint short-term activities rely on what? They rely on anaerobic metabolism, glycolysis, and fermentation. So amphibians rely mostly on anaerobic metabolism instead of aerobic cell respiration. Now, if we look at the type of heart that we see in a reptile, reptiles also have a heart with 3 chambers. So they have a right atrium that receives blood coming back from the body, deoxygenated blood. They have a left atrium that receives blood coming back from the lungs, oxygenated blood. And they have 1 ventricle, but there's a difference. Notice that there's kind of a wall of muscle in between the right and left parts of the ventricle. And this wall of muscle doesn't completely separate the ventricles, but it separates them for the most part. This wall is called a septum. Anytime we have a division in an organ, it's generally called a septum. That thing in the middle of your nose between the right nostril and the left nostril is a septum. So this septum separates most of the right ventricle from most of the left ventricle. And then notice there are 2 separate blood vessels coming out of the ventricles. One is a blood vessel, and it takes this deoxygenated blood, and this blood vessel carries this deoxygenated blood to the lungs. In the lungs, it picks up oxygen, and then it returns to the heart, returns to the right atrium through this blood vessel. And it's now oxygenated blood because it just went to the lungs. And then it goes down to the left ventricle. And if we look at the blood vessel coming out of the left ventricle, this is still orange. This is oxygenated blood. So this carries the blood to all the systemic circulation, to the head, to the legs, to the abdomen, and all the various systems of the body. After it drops off oxygen, then it comes back as deoxygenated blood on the right side. So even though reptiles still have a heart with 3 chambers, because of this septum, they have a much better separation of blood that's oxygenated from blood that's deoxygenated. Now, if we look at birds and mammals, notice that all birds and mammals have a 4-chambered heart. They have 2 atria. They have a right atrium and a left atrium. And they have 2 ventricles. They have a right ventricle and a left ventricle. So the deoxygenated blood is completely separated from the oxygenated blood. And the big advantage of this is much better for aerobic cell respiration. Now, having said that, even though this is much better for aerobic cell respiration, keep in mind that you don't want to underestimate animals that rely on anaerobic metabolism. Every year, there are several people who get mauled by alligators because if you go to some parts of the American South, there are alligators, and a lot of times they live in drainage ditches, or sometimes they get into ponds on golf courses. And so a lot of people see an alligator laying in the water and they walk up close to get a better look. And when they walk up close to get a better look, guess what the alligator does in many cases? It springs out of the water and it chases them. Now, alligators are using mostly anaerobic metabolism. So alligators can't run very long, but they're sprinters. And guess what? If you're bending down over a pond and you're looking to get a look at that cute little alligator, you're probably running backwards to get away from the alligator, and the alligator is going forwards. And even though it can only run fast for maybe 30 feet, 40 feet, it might catch you in that first 30 or 40 feet. So a lot of people who get attacked by alligators get attacked because they move in closer to get a look at them. So keep in mind, they can still sprint very fast, just not for very long. So don't pace yourself if you're being chased by an alligator, is what I'm saying. Run fast. Now, notice that like a lot of the other groups that we've talked about, when we look at amphibians, amphibians have a larva. In frogs and toads, we call that larval stage a tadpole. And if we look at frogs, they're a good example. Insects are kind of a little bit abstract since we don't know that much about them. But if we look at frogs, tadpoles live in the water, and tadpoles eat mostly algae, and they'll eat other microscopic organisms that are, any type of protist that they happen to swallow. But if we look at frogs, frogs live on the land, typically close to water, but frogs are carnivorous. They eat insects. Now keep in mind, frogs are not nearly as good as some of the nature specials show them to be. When I was studying toads with my friend, we would sometimes sit and watch toads try to catch insects, and they zap out their tongue, and sometimes they hit themselves in the eye. They miss about 50% of the time. So they're not quite as good as it might appear. But notice, tadpoles live in the water, they're aquatic. Adults live on the land, they're terrestrial. They eat different foods. Now, what's the advantage of all this? Well, there's a couple of reasons. First of all, if you have something that's a predator, something that eats tadpoles in the water, probably can't get onto the land and eat adult frogs and toads. But more than that, think about one of Darwin's ideas. One of Darwin's ideas is there aren't enough resources to go around. So if the tadpoles eat a different food than the adults, they're not competing for the same food anymore. And this means that the environment can support a higher population before, there starts to be competition for scarce resources. And just the fact that they live in water versus living on land, if they need places to hide from the predators, they're not competing for the same places to hide from the predators. So this is a good example of some of the advantages that we see by having a larval stage that's very different than the adult stage. They use different resources, they don't compete. So what does that mean? The environment can support a bigger population. And for most living organisms in nature, the smaller your population is, the more likely you are to go extinct if something bad happens. So having a larger population can be advantageous. Now, from the amphibians, reptiles evolved. And we'll talk about several specific adaptations, but one of the general things we can point out about reptiles is reptiles are much better adapted to life on land than amphibians are. And as a result, where I mentioned we can find amphibians in deserts sometimes, they're usually dormant most of the year. They become active when the rainy season comes for a couple weeks. Reptiles like snakes and lizards are found in some of the driest, hottest environments on Earth. So they're much better adapted to land. So let's think about some of the reasons why. So if we look at amphibians, we said that their skin was permeable to water. If we look at reptiles, what we see is that reptiles have a skin covering of scales, and the scales are almost waterproof. Keep in mind, living organisms don't have very many structures that are completely waterproof, and that's because living organisms have to exchange water with their environment. But they're so waterproof, they're very good at preventing dehydration. So from that point of view, this helps reptiles. Now, since reptiles live on land, they tend to have thicker bones than amphibians. They tend to have increased muscle mass. Why do they need this? Well, because if you live on land, you have to support your body weight. You've all been in a swimming pool or maybe an ocean or Lake Michigan, where the water supports a lot of your weight. This is one of the reasons that the largest animals that have lived are whales, because they don't have to hold their body up. The water holds their body up. Now, since reptiles don't live in the water like amphibians or near the water like adult amphibians, they've got to support their own body weight. So their bones are thicker and their muscles are bigger. They also produce a different type of waste product. When we look at reptiles, reptiles produce something called uric acid. And uric acid is a nitrogenous waste. And when we say nitrogenous waste, we really just means that it eliminates nitrogen from the body. So nitrogen is crucial because when it builds up in high levels in the body, it can produce some poisonous compounds like ammonia. So nitrogen wastes typically have to be eliminated. Now, one of the nice things about uric acid composed to some other chemicals is when uric acid is eliminated in the urine, it doesn't carry a lot of water with it. And since it doesn't carry a lot of water with it, this helps to conserve water. Notice that nitrogenous compounds, things that contain nitrogen that are found in the urine, these are some of the main compounds in urine that give it kind of a yellowish color or a brownish color, that give it some distinct color. So if your urine is colored, really it generally means that you're dehydrated. Urine should be just about colorless. You shouldn't be able to see any color with it. Now, what can potentially make you dehydrated? Well, just if you have so much nitrogenous waste that you have to eliminate. So for instance, some people do fad diets where they mostly eat proteins. And the thing with proteins is, remember, proteins are made from amino acids, which have that amine group, which has nitrogen. If you eat a lot of proteins, when they get inside your body converts proteins to glucose that it can use in glycolysis, or some other compounds further down the line in glycolysis or the Krebs cycle. So when you convert them into a carbohydrate, carbohydrates don't have nitrogen. So you have to get rid of that nitrogen. So if you have a diet very high in nitrogen, your urine might be a really pretty color. Or if you take multivitamins that have large amounts of vitamin C and some of the B vitamins. Vitamin C and the B vitamins are all water soluble, which means if you take a vitamin for breakfast and it's got all the vitamins you need that day in it, most of the vitamins that you're not using right now get eliminated in your urine because they're water soluble. So you don't really store the B vitamins or vitamin C very well. Now, there's another factor that helps reptiles survive on dry land. They have internal fertilization of eggs. So the eggs are fertilized inside the female's body. And not only are the eggs fertilized inside the female's body, and remember what I said earlier, this means that the female's body supplies the water for the sperm to swim to the eggs. Reptiles have a type of egg called amniotic eggs. And amniotic eggs are composed of 4 structures called membranes. Notice they're not the same as a plasma membrane. A membrane in biology is one of those words, kind of like nucleus in science, where we have the nucleus of a cell and the nucleus of an atom. Membrane is used in a lot of different ways. So if we look at an embryo inside an animal with an amniotic egg, so here's our embryo, this kind of pink thing. And around the embryo, we have an amniotic cavity. And this amniotic cavity is filled with fluid, amniotic fluid. And around this, there's a layer of tissue called the amnion. So the amnion surrounds the embryo. Now notice that the groups that evolved from reptiles, birds and mammals, also have amniotic eggs. So in a person, there's a procedure that we do called amniocentesis, where we stick a needle into this amniotic cavity and we suck out a little bit of the fluid. And typically the reason that we do this is we can look for certain birth defects. When a human embryo starts to form, you might think that the main thing that's happening is that the embryo is absorbing nutrients through the placenta, the cells are dividing by mitosis, so the body is getting bigger. But if we look at an embryo, actually from almost the beginning, cells start to die as well. For instance, if you look at your hand with your 5 fingers, if you would look at the hand in an embryo, we don't see any fingers. The hand looks like a paddle. It's solid. And then what happens is the cells in between the fingers start to die and they're lost. And when they're lost, they kind of slough off and they're floating around in this amniotic fluid. So when we do amniocentesis, we can suction up some of this fluid, pick up a few cells, and then we can examine the DNA in these cells to look for certain types of birth defects. Now, when we talk about a woman's water breaking right before she gives birth, that's really this amnion rupturing and some amniotic fluid leaks out. Now, if we look at the amnion, what we see is hooked into the digestive system is another one of the membranes, something called the yolk, or it's sometimes called the yolk sac. And the yolk provides nutrients for the developing embryo. In the case of mammals, mammals can get some of their nutrients from the mother through the placenta. But if we think about reptiles or birds or the very earliest stages of development of a mammal, the placenta isn't built yet. So the yolk provides nutrients. So mammal eggs do have a little tiny bit of yolk, not very much compared to, say, a bird egg or a reptile egg. Now, notice that the yolk only refers to the yellow part. And some people think the yellow part is the embryo, but actually the yellow part is the yolk. And if the egg were fertilized, the embryo would be a little spot kind of right on top of the yolk. The white part is more nutrients. So one membrane is that amnion. Another membrane is this yolk sac. A third membrane is the allantois. And the allantois, notice this is it coming out and then curving around. The allantois also comes out of the digestive system, the gut of the animal. And the allantois stores waste products. Now notice it doesn't really store feces, because feces are the result of food that you eat and then you can't digest. So it passes through your system undigested. The allantois, this embryo isn't eating any food. Its nutrients are either coming from the yolk or from the mother through the placenta. This allantois stores metabolic waste. This is part of that substance that babies produce right after they're born in their first bowel movement called meconium. So both of these two membranes, the allantois and the yolk sac, are connected to the digestive system, the gut. And then around the whole thing, there's a thin white line. This is the chorion. And this surrounds the embryo and all the other membranes. And this is a protective layer. In mammals, like people, the chorion makes up part of the placenta. It makes up the part of the placenta that the embryo builds. Part of the placenta is built by the mother as well. Now, those are the four membranes. Some organisms that make amniotic eggs, reptiles and birds, those organisms also produce a shell. Mammals do not produce a shell. So notice that the shell is not one of the four membranes of the amniotic egg. Now, what's the advantage of the amniotic egg? Well, besides providing all this food, fish eggs have some yolk and they don't have an amniotic egg. Amphibian eggs have some yolk and they don't have an amniotic egg. But one of the big advantages is this amnion itself, this fluid-filled sac. If we look at most other animals, think about when we discussed amphibians a few moments ago. We talked about internal or external fertilization in amphibians. Well, think about it. If the sperm fertilizes the egg outside the female's body, then the eggs don't develop inside the mother. So the eggs actually develop out in the water. There are some amphibians, certain species of frogs that live around here, that actually attach their eggs to strands of grass that are growing up out of the water in shallow areas. But the eggs just kind of float around. And the eggs have to be in an aqueous environment, a watery environment. So for organisms that make amniotic eggs, the aqueous environment is that amniotic fluid. Now, one advantage of this is, we've got this chorion. So if we look at eggs that are produced by amniotes, they're a little bit harder for predators to eat. In most mammals, if a predator wants to eat an egg, it's got to eat mom. If we look at birds, the eggshells are hard. So there are lots of animals that can break through those eggshells, other birds, snakes, but insects generally can't eat eggshells unless they're cracked. Now, reptiles have soft eggs, kind of leathery eggs, and they still provide some protection for the embryo. So not only do reptiles have amniotic eggs, but birds do, and mammals do. So notice if we were trying to separate birds from mammals, we couldn't really use an amniotic egg because that would be one of those things that Cladeism calls a shared ancestral characteristic, something that all these animals have inherited from their ancestors. Now, although the eggs are the same, don't get the idea that everything about either reptile or bird reproduction is the same as in mammals. If we look at some reptiles, like most of the crocodilians, when a female crocodile lays her eggs, she lays them near the bank of a river typically, not too far away, maybe 100 yards or so, it depends on the species. And then she covers them in a pile of mud and rotting leaves. Now, the advantage of all this decaying vegetation is that when the vegetation starts to decay, it produces heat. So this pile of vegetation heats up. Chickens sit on their eggs to provide the heat for the embryo to develop. In mammals, the egg is inside the mother's body. In the case of reptiles, this heat produced by the rotting organic material, as well as the sun baking this mud, the mud is dark in color. Dark colors tend to absorb more sunlight. So this heats up the area where she's laid the eggs. Now, by itself, that's not that strange, but what is a little bit unusual is the temperature of this pile, at least the area where a particular egg is developing. That's what determines the gender of the eggs that hatch for crocodilians. Warm temperatures versus cool temperatures give different sexes. So it's not completely something that's genetically determined if we talk about the gender of a reptile. So we want to keep this in mind. Now, if we look at the reptiles, some people include birds as reptiles. This is not actually a bird, this is a velociraptor, because birds evolved from the group that includes velociraptors. Notice that most real velociraptors, there's been one species that has been discovered that's fairly large, but it's not as big as the velociraptors in Jurassic Park. And notice this velociraptor, it's fairly accurate. Most species of velociraptor that have been discovered in the fossil record would come up to about your knee. But, you know, wouldn't be a very scary movie if they did that. So by the end of this class, my goal is that you'll never be able to watch a science fiction movie again and, you know, just take the biology for granted. So they had to make velociraptors a lot bigger because they wanted to make them scary. And actually, when the Jurassic Park movies were made, the species of velociraptor that's about the same height as a human hadn't even been discovered then. So we only knew about the tiny ones. Now, one of the things that identifies animals as birds is they have a skin covering of feathers. And as we're starting to discover more fossils, we're finding more and more fossil dinosaurs that also have a covering of feathers. And this is one of the main reasons why a lot of biologists consider that birds are just a specialized group of dinosaurs. They get their own class mostly because they were separated into their own class a long time ago, and because a lot of people who study birds are really fanatical about studying them. So it's one of those things that biologically birds probably should be classified with reptiles, but from a practical standpoint, it probably won't happen. Now, in both the dinosaurs that have been discovered with feathers and in birds, one of the main purposes of feathers is to insulate the body, to retain heat. Because we'll talk later, but sometimes birds are referred to as being warm-blooded. So since they're warm-blooded, if you're warm-blooded, you know, think about the name, it gives you a hint. Your body kind of works like a furnace. Think about human body temperature. Human body temperature, 98.6 degrees, about 37 degrees Celsius. That's really hot. You know, if it was 98.6 degrees outside every day, we would consider that to be extremely hot, but that's our everyday body temperature. So if you don't want to lose all that heat, because remember, you're in contact with your environment through your skin. So the skin is the surface area, your internal volume is your metabolism. If you don't want to lose that heat, you have to have some insulation. So if you look at a lot of birds, when you see the actual body of the bird is pretty small compared to how it looks when you're observing the feathers. Why is the body so small? Because the birds fluff out the feathers a little bit so that they have a layer of air between the feathers and their body. That layer of air gets warmed up and helps to insulate them. People use the same principle when we make things like down jackets. Down is a type of feather. So the idea of down jackets is there are some air pockets in this insulating area. Those air pockets get warmed up by your body heat, and then you have kind of a buffer between you and the cold air of winter. Are there any questions about the groups we've talked about so far? We're not quite done with birds, but I think we're getting towards the end. So I want to give you a little bit of other information before we stop.
I had a question.
Sure.
Are anacondas considered like amphibians too, even though, because they live in water?
Even though they live in water, anacondas are reptiles. They do have scales. The longest snakes ever discovered have been anacondas. And anacondas can get about as big as 21 feet long. That's about the biggest that have ever been discovered. But keep in mind, when they get about 21 feet long, they only weigh a couple 100 pounds. So, you know, they don't necessarily weigh more than a very large person would. And if you ever saw any of those, you know, bad science fiction movies, Anaconda, and then I think they made about 50 sequels. If you ever saw any of those, anacondas do eat very large prey. Anacondas can eat small deer. They can eat wild pigs. And an anaconda could potentially eat a person. But again, one of the places where the movie kind of misses the mark in terms of biology is if you look at a big snake like an anaconda. If an anaconda eats a big meal like a pig, or if an anaconda would come along and eat you for dinner, they wouldn't have to eat again for several months. So in the movie, the anaconda kills a person, and then it immediately, you know, the deputy has to tell the sheriff it's going to strike again, you know, it's going to kill more people. In real life, if an anaconda ate somebody today, the deputy would come into the sheriff and would say, "Sheriff, the anaconda ate Bill, and if we don't do something fast, it's going to kill somebody else by about the 4th of July." You know, the movie would lose a little bit of dramatic tension if the anaconda was going to wait a few months before it ate somebody new. So the anaconda mostly just kills people and doesn't eat them in the movie. Not sure exactly why. So later today or tomorrow, I will have some questions posted on fungi, and I keep calling them the fungus questions, but they actually do have some questions on Protista too. And these will be due Monday night when we come back from break. So you don't have to work on them over break if you want to. I would recommend you might want to, so you don't have to hurry after class on Monday. And if you get really bored over break, keep in mind I have some information on some of the other papers that you're going to have to do, are not really papers as much as you're going to have to make some lists of different organisms in different groups. And I have some information on that if you want to work on any of that over break. I will post the fungus and protista questions. They'll be at the end of this week, week 8. But the other stuff I'm not going to post until we get back. So if you want anything, just send me an email. And you're going to have, there's 3 potential lists. One is on plants, one is on insects, and one is on mammals. So if you want to work on one of those or more than one of those, I would be happy to send them to you. Are there any questions? Okay, if not,
is
go ahead.
midterms during, sorry, are midterms this week, or is it after break?
I have to double check. I either have to turn in the midterm grades next Monday night by midnight, so over break, or it might be the Monday we get back. I'm not positive. We don't have a special midterm test, so your grade is just what your average is right now. I always tell people don't get real excited about your midterm grade, because at this point, well, I don't have the bacteria stuff graded, so I would have that graded either way. I'll tell you what those grades are before Monday, but by the time those get graded and the fungus tests that'll be due Monday when we come back, we'll have about 40% of the points, but right now we only have about 20% of the points for the class. So if your average isn't quite where you want it, there's still a lot of time to change it. I guess on the other hand, the warning is if your average is very good, don't assume that you can coast the rest of the way in. There's still several assignments to go. So if you want to find out, I will, send me an email over break and wait till after Sunday, because I should have the papers graded by then. I've only read them twice, and I have to read them 3 times usually. But by Sunday, I should know what your midterm grade is if you want to find out what it is. Or if you go and just look it up online, it will tell you what your midterm grades are as they're submitted. So you might see some of your midterm grades, but not others, depending on when each teacher submits them.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Have a good break.
Thank you. You too.
So
All right, bye.
Bye. Enjoy the off time.
You too.
Now that you're feeling better, you might actually be able to enjoy it a little.
Yeah. That's it.
And it sounds like the weather's going to actually be nice.
The weekend is gonna be nice. Think so.
So,
All right.
Thank you. Have a good
Velociraptors
break.
in Jurassic Park,
Yes?
they're not based on real velociraptors. They're based on a whole different type of dinosaur.
Of course, they just forgot to mention that.
Deinonychus.
That's what happens when you do genetic engineering. It's not nice to fool Mother Nature.
All right, have a good break.
You too, Nick.
Thank you. Have a good break.
You too. Bye-bye.